Welcome, dear listener, to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean, and together we'll search for truth where others see only tea and roses. But beware, behind the lace curtains lurks betrayal, and behind every clue, a killer waits. In the misty halls of Willow Grange, a virtuoso violinist collapses mid-concerto, his bow dropping like a deadly whisper. But the strings are intact. Death came from the bow itself, laced with a rare poison that seeped through a tiny cut with every stroke. Enter Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming sleuth with eyes sharper than a blade. As guests whisper secrets, debts, forbidden romances, blackmail, she unravels a web of betrayal. Was it the indebted nephew, the heartbroken widow, or the devoted doctor hiding a lethal dose? Twists of jealousy and desperation lead to a shocking confession, proving that in this symphony of murder, silence is the deadliest note. Dive into The Silent Violin, a classic thriller where every clue plays a part. Chapter 1. The Concert at Willow Grange. The fog clung to the ancient oaks lining the drive to Willow Grange like a shroud, muffling the crunch of gravel under carriage wheels on that crisp October evening in 1928. The estate, a grand relic of Georgian splendour, stood sentinel over the rolling hills of the parish bordering St. Mary Mead, its windows spilling golden light into the encroaching dusk. Inside the great hall, crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flickering glow over an eclectic gathering of locals and luminaries, all drawn by the promise of an extraordinary recital. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in a velvet-upholstered armchair near the fireplace, adjusted her spectacles and let her knitting needles resume their rhythmic dance. She had accepted the invitation from her old acquaintance, Lady Beatrice Harrow, more out of curiosity than musical fervour. At her age, one learned to appreciate the subtle symphonies of human behaviour amid such assemblies. Her keen blue eyes, deceptively mild, swept the room, cataloguing details with the precision of a seasoned archivist. Lady Beatrice herself dominated the centre, her posture rigid as a sceptre, her gown of emerald silk whispering with each imperious gesture. Diamonds at her throat caught the light like distant stars. But Miss Marple noted the faint lines of strain around her mouth, perhaps the weight of hosting, or something more concealed. Beside her hovered her nephew, Charles Harrow, a tall fellow in his late 20s with the sleek charm of a fox. His fingers drummed restlessly on a champagne flute, his eyes darting toward the door as if expecting an unwelcome visitor. Miss Marple recalled whispers from the village. Young Charles had a taste for high-stakes cards in London clubs, the kind that left pockets lighter and tempers frayed. Not far off stood Dr. Simon Gale, the parish physician, his once handsome face now etched with the weariness of too many midnight calls. He nursed a tumbler of brandy, his gaze distant as, though replaying some internal diagnosis, Miss Marple wondered at his pallor. Doctors, in her experience, often guarded secrets as fiercely as they did remedies. Then there was Clara Weston, the young widow from the nearby cottage, her black mourning dress a stark contrast to the room's gaiety. She clutched her sherry glass with white-knuckled fingers, her laughter brittle and forced as she conversed with a cluster of guests. A tremor ran through her hand, spilling a drop onto the Persian rug. Nerves, Miss Marple mused, or the shadow of a deeper fear? Clara's late husband had been a musician himself, she remembered, lost at sea 2 years prior. Coincidences, in her view, were seldom mere happenstance. The murmur of conversation swelled as the clock struck 8, heralding the arrival of the evening star, Monsieur Etienne Duval, the celebrated violinist from Paris. He entered with a flourish, his dark hair swept back, his evening suit impeccable, carrying his priceless Stradivarius as one might a cherished child. Applause rippled through the hall as he ascended the makeshift stage, a raised platform adorned with ferns and candles. Duval bowed deeply, his smile charismatic, yet Miss Marple detected a flicker of arrogance in his eyes. A man accustomed to adoration, perhaps blind to enmity. A profound silence descended as he positioned the violin beneath his chin, the bow poised like a conductor's baton. The first notes of Vivaldi's Four Seasons, specifically winter, pierced the air, evoking the chill of frost and the fury of storms. The melody wove through the room, captivating all, even Miss Marple's needles stilled momentarily, drawn into the violin's plaintive cry. Duval's fingers flew with virtuoso grace, the bow gliding in seamless arcs, each stroke coaxing forth waves of emotion. But then abruptly, the harmony shattered. Midway through a crescendo, Duval faltered. A discordant scrape escaped the strings, his bow hand trembling. The audience leaned forward, breaths held. He gasped, a sharp intake that echoed unnaturally loud, his face contorting in agony. The bow slipped from his grasp, clattering against the polished wood of the stage. Duval clutched at his chest, staggering backward, before crumpling to the floor in a heap, the violin tumbling beside him with a final, mournful twang. Gasps erupted into cries of alarm. Ladies fanned themselves, gentlemen surged forward. Dr. Gale pushed through the throng, kneeling by the fallen artist. "Stand back!" he barked, his professional mask slipping into place. He felt for a pulse, his expression darkening. "He's gone," he announced, voice barely above a whisper. "Dead." Miss Marple remained in her seat, her knitting forgotten on her lap. She observed the chaos with detached fascination. Lady Beatrice's hand flying to her mouth, Charles's face straining of colour, Clara's glass shattering on the floor. How swiftly the tune changes, she thought, her mind already piecing together the discordant notes of the evening. Death, unbidden and theatrical, has claimed the spotlight. But why here? Why now? In the recesses of her thoughts, a puzzle began to form, its edges sharp with suspicion. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime, the great hall of Willow Grange. Moments ago, a sanctuary of melodic enchantment, transformed in an instant into a tableau of pandemonium. Shrieks pierced the air like shattered glass, mingling with the low murmurs of disbelief that rippled through the crowd. Chairs scraped against the parquet floor as guests rose in unison, their faces masks of horror and morbid curiosity. The chandeliers, which had bathed the room in a soft, inviting luminescence, now seemed to cast harsh shadows, accentuating the pallor on every cheek and the wide-eyed stares fixed upon the crumpled form on the stage. Dr. Simon Gale, his knees pressing into the velvet runner that carpeted the platform, leaned closer to the violinist's body. His fingers, steady despite the adrenaline surging through him, probed the neck for any sign of a carotid pulse. Nothing. He tilted Duval's head back gently, checking for breath. None came. The man's skin was already cooling, a clammy sheen of sweat beading on his forehead. Gale's mind raced through differentials. Heart attack, aneurysm, perhaps a sudden embolism. But something nagged at him. An irregularity in the way Duval had collapsed. The gasp that had sounded more like a choke than a cardiac arrest. "Someone fetch the constable!" A voice boomed from the back. Sir Reginald Thorpe, a retired colonel with a moustache that bristled like a hedgehog. His command cut through the din, prompting a footman to dart from the room, his livery tails flapping. Lady Beatrice Harrow, recovering her composure with the steel of her aristocratic breeding, stepped forward, her voice ringing out like a bell. "Everyone, please remain calm. Dr. Gale is attending to him. Move back, give him space." But calm was a distant dream. Clara Weston, her morning dress now stained with spilled sherry, had sunk into a nearby chair, her hands covering her mouth as if to stifle a scream that never came. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were locked on Duval's lifeless form. Miss Marple, still in her armchair by the fire, noted the widow's reaction with interest. It was not mere shock. There was a familiarity in that gaze, a personal grief that went beyond the loss of a performer. She knew him, Miss Marple thought, her mind filing away the observation like a card in an index, more than admired from afar, I suspect. Charles Harrow, meanwhile, had edged closer to the stage, his face a study in feigned concern. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, a gesture Miss Marple recognized as one of nervous distraction. He glanced toward his aunt, then back at the body, his eyes lingering on the fallen bow. "Oh, what do you see there, young man?" she wondered. "Or rather, what do you fear others might see?" Dr. Gale straightened, wiping, his hands on a handkerchief produced from his pocket. "He's dead," he confirmed to the hovering Lady Beatrice. "No doubt about it. I'll need to examine him more thoroughly, but it appears sudden, possibly natural causes." His tone carried a hint of uncertainty, one that did not escape Miss Marple's ears. Doctors, she knew, were loath to admit ignorance, especially in public. The room buzzed with speculation. "Heart failure," whispered Mrs. Eldridge, a plump matron with a penchant for gossip. "He was in his prime." Her companion, a bespectacled vicar, shook his head solemnly. "The Lord calls us at any hour." But Miss Marple dismissed such platitudes. Death, in her experience, was rarely so poetic without human intervention. Time stretched as they awaited the authorities. The footman returned, breathless, announcing that the local constable was on his way and that a telegram had been sent to the county police headquarters. Lady Beatrice, ever the hostess, instructed servants to circulate with trays of brandy and tea, an attempt to restore some semblance of order. Guests clustered in small groups, their conversations a low hum of theories and reminiscences about Duval's illustrious career. "I saw him play in Vienna once," one elderly gentleman boasted. "A maestro like no other." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea, her eyes never leaving the stage. The body lay undisturbed, the violin beside it, strings gleaming innocently under the lights. The bow, however, had skittered a few feet away, its tip pointing accusatorily toward the audience. She strained to see from her seat. Was there something unusual about it? A slight discoloration on the horsehair, perhaps. But distance obscured the detail. It was nearly an hour before the authorities arrived, the fog delaying their progress. First came Constable Polk, a burly man with a red face and a notebook at the ready. He took one look at the scene and blanched, clearly out of his depth. "Blimey," he muttered, "not every day we have a death at Willow Grange." He cordoned off the stage with improvised barriers, chairs, and a velvet rope, and began taking statements from the nearest witnesses. But it was the arrival of Inspector Derek Craddock that brought a true sense of officialdom. Craddock, a sharp-featured man in his 40s with a neatly trimmed moustache and a no-nonsense air, strode in accompanied by a sergeant and a police doctor. Miss Marple knew him well from previous encounters in St. Mary Mead. He was competent, if sometimes dismissive, of amateur insights. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a nod as he passed, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Fancy meeting you here." "Not involved, I hope." "Merely a guest, Inspector," she replied mildly, her knitting needles clicking once more, "though one can't help but observe." Craddock wasted no time. He conferred briefly with Dr. Gale, then approached the body. The police doctor, a wiry fellow named Dr. Haydock, another acquaintance from St. Mary, Mead knelt to perform a preliminary examination. "No external wounds," Haydock announced after a few minutes. "Pupils dilated, cyanosis around the lips. Could be poison or a massive coronary. We'll need an autopsy to be sure. Poison." The word hung in the air like a discordant note. Craddock's eyes sharpened. "Poison? Administered how?" "He was playing the violin, for heaven's sake," Dr. Gale interjected. "He had a small cut on his right index finger." "I noticed it when I checked him. Fresh, I'd say." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "A cut, you say? How intriguing." Her voice was soft, but it carried to Craddock, who turned to her. "You have thoughts, Miss Marple?" "Only that musicians often sustain such injuries from their instruments. Strings can be sharp, but perhaps it's worth examining the violin closely." Craddock nodded to his sergeant. "Bag the violin and bow, carefully." The sergeant, gloves on, lifted the Stradivarius first, inspecting its body, neck, and strings. "Strings intact, sir. No signs of tampering here." Then the bow. As he picked it up, Miss Marple rose from her chair for the first time, approaching with her characteristic unhurried gait. "If I may, Inspector," she said, peering at the bow in the sergeant's hands. The horsehair, taut and white, seemed ordinary at first glance. But up close, she spotted it, a faint oily residue along the length, almost imperceptible. "The bow," she murmured, "not the violin." "The bow is where the secret lies." Craddock frowned. "What makes you say that?" "Think of it, Inspector. Every stroke of the bow against the strings. If the hair were treated with something, a toxin perhaps, it could enter through that cut with each movement. A slow, insidious delivery." The room had quieted, guests straining to hear. Lady Beatrice gasped. "Poison on the bow!" But who would do such a thing? Craddock, intrigued despite himself, instructed the sergeant to seal the bow in an evidence bag. "We'll have it analysed in London. Top priority." He turned back to the body, directing photographs to be taken from various angles. Flashbulbs popped, illuminating Duval's contorted features in stark relief. As the investigation proceeded, Craddock began preliminary interviews right there in the hall, using a side alcove for privacy. First was Lady Beatrice. "Monsieur Duval arrived this afternoon," she explained, her voice steady but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He rested in the guest suite, then rehearsed briefly in the music room. The bow and violin were with him the whole time, I believe. Anyone have access to his things?" Craddock pressed. "The music room is open." Servants, guests, anyone could have wandered in. Next, Charles Harrow. The young man sat rigidly, his charm evaporated. "I barely knew the chap," he claimed. "Met him once in London, at a club. He was a gambler, you know. Owed a few debts himself, from what I heard." Miss Marple, eavesdropping discreetly from nearby, noted the lie. Charles's earlier restlessness suggested more than a passing acquaintance. Debts, she thought, always a motive. Clara Weston was more evasive. I admired his music, she said, her eyes downcast. That's all. But her trembling voice betrayed her. Craddock probed gently, but she offered nothing more. Dr. Gale's turn came last among the key figures. I treated Duval for a minor ailment last week when he visited the area, he admitted. Nothing serious, a cold, but that cut on his finger. He mentioned nicking it on a string during practice. Craddock jotted notes furiously. Any enemies you know of? Gale hesitated. Artists like him attract jealousy, but nothing specific. As the interviews wrapped, the body was covered with a sheet and prepared for removal. The guests were dismissed with instructions not to leave the area. Miss Marple lingered, her mind whirring. The cut, the bow, the residues, pieces of a puzzle. But motives lurked in the shadows. Charles's debts, Clara's secrets, Gale's knowledge of poisons, perhaps even Lady Beatrice's strained hospitality. Outside, the fog had thickened, mirroring the mystery. Craddock approached Miss Marple as she gathered her shawl. Your bow theory. It's plausible, but proof? Send it to the lab inspector. And watch the suspects. People reveal themselves in crisis. He nodded thoughtfully. I'll keep you informed. As she stepped into the night, a chill wind whispered through the oaks. The silent violin, she pondered, but the bough sings a deadly tune. The scene of the crime was set, but the performance was far from over. The Constable Polk was tasked with guarding the stage while Craddock coordinated. He paced nervously, his boots thudding dully. Miss Marple, sensing his unease, engaged him in conversation. A shocking business, Constable, she said. Have you seen many such scenes? Polk shook his head. Not in these parts, ma'am. Mostly poachers and petty theft. This is unnatural. Unnatural indeed, she agreed. Her eyes drifted to the audience chairs, where a program lay discarded. She picked it up, noting Duval's biography. Born in Paris, rose to fame in the salons of Europe, known for his passionate interpretations and equally passionate affairs. Affairs, she thought. Another string to pluck. Lady Beatrice, overseeing the servants clearing glasses, paused to speak with Miss Marple. Jane, dear, what do you make of it? You always see things others miss. Miss Marple smiled modestly. People are like knitting patterns, Beatrice. One dropped stitch, and the whole thing unravels. Tell me, was Monsieur Duval's visit purely for the concert? Lady Beatrice glanced around. He was an old friend of the family. My late husband knew him from Paris days, but Charles, he seemed tense around him. Interesting. Miss Marple filed that away. Craddock, meanwhile, examined the music room adjacent to the hall. It was a cosy space with a grand piano, sheet music scattered, and a stand, where the violin had rested. No signs of struggle, but a half-empty glass of water on the table. Test that too, he ordered. The sergeant sniffed it. No odour, sir. But poisons can be odourless, Miss Marple interjected from the doorway. Craddock sighed, but nodded. As the night wore on, more details emerged. A maid recalled seeing Charles in the music room that afternoon. He was looking at the bow, ma'am. Said he was admiring the craftsmanship. Charles, when recalled, denied it. I may have glanced in, but I didn't touch anything. Clara overheard whispering to Gale, This is horrible. He didn't deserve this. Gale's reply, No one does. But secrets have a way of catching up. Miss Marple's ears perked. Secrets. The web thickened. The police doctor, Haydock, pulled Craddock aside. "That cut? It's precise, like from a wire. And the symptoms, convulsions, rapid onset, suggests a neurotoxin, perhaps curare or something similar." Craddock whistled. "Exotic, not your common garden poison." "Indeed," Haydock said, "someone with knowledge." Eyes turned to Gale, the doctor. He protested. "I have access to drugs, but nothing like that." Miss Marple pondered. Doctors knew poisons, but so did chemists or travellers to exotic lands. Charles had mentioned London clubs, perhaps connections there. The guests departed in carriages, the fog swallowing them. Miss Marple accepted a ride from Lady Beatrice. "Stay the night, Jane." "It's late," she agreed, her mind buzzing. In her guest room, she sat by the window knitting. The bow, the cut, the motives, all intertwined. Morning dawned misty. Craddock returned with news. The lab would take days, but initial tests on the glass showed nothing. The bow, however, had traces of an oily substance. Miss Marple smiled. "The bow it is, but who applied it?" The investigation deepened. Chapter 3. The Guests Under Scrutiny. The morning after the tragedy at Willow Grange broke with a brittle clarity, the fog having retreated to reveal a sky of pale, unyielding grey. The estate, so resplendent the previous evening, now seemed to crouch under the weight of its own secrets. Its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows harbouring whispers of the night's grim drama. Inside, the drawing-room had been commandeered by Inspector Craddock for his interviews, its heavy damask curtains drawn back to admit the cold light of day. A fire crackled in the grate, but it did little to warm the atmosphere, thick with suspicion and unspoken fears. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near a window overlooking the frost-kissed lawns, sipped her morning tea with deliberate calm. Her knitting lay in her lap, a soft grey shawl taking shape under her deft fingers, but her true work was observation. The drawing-room was a microcosm of the village and its visitors, each guest a thread in the intricate tapestry she was beginning to unravel. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing. The way Lady Beatrice's fingers tightened around her teacup, the restless pacing of Charles Harrow, the way Clara Weston's gaze darted toward the door as if contemplating flight, and Dr. Gale's studied avoidance of eye contact as he stirred his coffee. Inspector Craddock, his notebook open and his pen poised, had set up at a mahogany writing desk, his sergeant stationed nearby to record statements. He was methodical, his questions probing yet polite, designed to elicit truth without alarming the guilty. Yet, Miss Marple admired his technique, though she knew from experience that the truth often lay not in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. She adjusted her shawl and listened, her presence unobtrusive yet inescapable, like a melody that lingers after the music stops. The first to be called was Lady Beatrice Harrow, who entered with the dignity of a queen summoned to a tribunal. She settled into the chair opposite Craddock, her emerald earrings catching the light, a stark contrast to the sombre mood. "Inspector," she began, her voice steady but with a faint tremor, "this is a dreadful business. Monsieur Duval was a guest in my home, a celebrated artist. I assure you, he had no enemies here." Craddock's pen scratched across the page. "No enemies, Lady Harrow? A man of his fame, his charisma, often attracts envy or resentment. Did he mention any troubles?" She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the window. "He was a private man, Inspector. He spoke of his music, not his personal affairs. He arrived yesterday, rested, rehearsed, and performed. That was all, and who had access to the music room where his violin and bow were kept. The room was open to servants and guests alike, she admitted. It's a common space for such events. But surely no one here would— Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands clasped together, knuckles whitening. She's protecting someone, she thought, or perhaps the reputation of her house. Craddock pressed on. Your nephew, Charles, did he know Duval well? Lady Beatrice's lips tightened. Charles met him in London, I believe. They shared an interest in cards. But Charles is a gentleman, Inspector. He would not stoop to violence. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. A gentleman with debts, she mused, recalling a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young man, much like Charles, had resorted to desperate measures to escape a creditor's grip. Gambling, she knew, could turn a gentleman into something else entirely. Charles Harrow was called next, his lanky frame slouching slightly as he took the seat. His tie was askew, and a sheen of perspiration glistened on his forehead despite the cool room. "Look here, Inspector," he began, his voice a touch too loud. "I barely knew Duval. Ran into him at a club in Mayfair last year. He was a sharp card player, cleaned me out once or twice. But murder? Preposterous!" Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You owed him? Money, then?" Charles shifted uncomfortably. "A trifling sum. A few £100, maybe. I was going to settle it. No need to kill a man over a debt." "How much is a few hundred?" Craddock pressed. Charles's face reddened. 500, perhaps 6, but I had it in hand. Aunt Beatrice was helping me out. Miss Marple's mind whirred. £500 or £600 was no trifling sum, especially for a young man living on his aunt's charity. She recalled Charles's nervous glances at the bow last night. Had he tampered with it, hoping to frighten Duval into forgiving the debt? Or was there more to his agitation? Young men, she thought, are so impulsive and so easily led astray. Clara Weston followed, her black dress making her appear like a spectre against the room's rich furnishings. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale, and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "I only knew Monsieur Duval through his music," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I attended his concerts in London once or twice. He was extraordinary." Craddock leaned forward. "You seemed deeply affected last night, Mrs. Weston." "More so than one might expect from a casual admirer." Her cheeks flushed, and she looked down. "It was the shock, Inspector. To see such a talent extinguished so suddenly, it was overwhelming." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Clara's words were careful, rehearsed even, but her hands betrayed her, twisting the edge of her handkerchief into knots. She's hiding something, Miss Marple thought. A connection, perhaps romantic, perhaps dangerous. Clara's late husband, a cellist, had moved in the same artistic circles as Duval. Had their paths crossed in Paris? Had Duval held some power over her, as he seemed to over Charles? Dr. Simon Gale was the last of the key figures to be interviewed that morning. He entered with a weary air, his medical bag clutched in one hand, as if it were a shield. "Inspector," he said, his voice low and measured, "I treated Duval last week for a minor respiratory ailment. He was in good health otherwise. The cut on his finger, he mentioned it was from a string snapping during practice." "Did you examine the cut?" Craddock asked. Gale nodded. "It was superficial, barely a scratch. I advised him to keep it clean. I had no reason to suspect anything more, You were in London recently, Doctor, Craddock said, his tone neutral but probing. Purchasing medical supplies, I understand? Gale's jaw tightened. Yes, for my practice. Standard items, bandages, antiseptics, nothing out of the ordinary. Miss Marple's needles paused. Doctors had access to all manner of substances, she knew, and not all were as innocent as antiseptics. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a chemist's assistant had misused his knowledge to deadly effect. Gale's fatigue, his distraction, were they signs of guilt, or merely the burden of a country doctor's life? As the interviews concluded, Craddock dismissed the guests with instructions to remain available. The room emptied, save for Miss Marple, who lingered, her tea growing cold. She rose and approached Craddock, who was reviewing his notes. "A complex affair, Inspector," she said softly. "So many motives, so few facts." He looked up, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "You've got that right, Miss Marple." "Any theories?" "Only that people are rarely what they seem," she replied, "and secrets like weeds grow best in fertile soil." She excused herself and wandered into the garden, where the air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and fading roses. The gravel paths crunched under her sensible shoes as she strolled toward a secluded arbour, her mind turning over the morning's revelations. It was there, shielded by overgrown yew hedges, that she overheard a hushed conversation. "You should have been more careful." Clara Weston's voice, low and urgent, carried on the breeze. Charles Harrow's reply was sharp. "It's done now, Clara. Keep quiet or we'll both be in trouble." Miss Marple froze, her heart quickening. A conspiracy, she wondered. Or two frightened people caught in a web they didn't spin. She stepped back silently, her knitting clutched to her chest, and made her way to the terrace, where she could observe without being seen. The garden was a maze of autumnal hues, russet leaves, golden chrysanthemums, and the last defiant blooms of lavender. But it was the human landscape that intrigued her most. Charles, now alone, lit a cigarette with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the grounds as if expecting pursuit. Clara emerged moments later, hurrying toward the house, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, where Lady Beatrice was overseeing the arrangement of fresh flowers, as if normalcy could erase the stain of death. "Jane, dear," she said, her voice strained, "you must think us cursed." "Not cursed, Beatrice," Miss Marple replied gently, "merely human. Tell me, did Charles spend much time with Duval before the concert?" Lady Beatrice hesitated. "They spoke briefly in the music room, I believe." Charles said he was ensuring the lighting was adequate. "He's always so helpful." Helpful, Miss Marple thought, or opportunistic. She recalled a maid's statement from the night before, mentioned in passing to Craddock. Charles had been seen handling the bow, admiring its craftsmanship. An innocent act, or a calculated one? As noon approached, Craddock received a preliminary report from the police doctor, delivered by a breathless messenger. The cut on Duval's finger showed signs of irritation, possibly from a foreign substance. The bow was en route to a laboratory in London for analysis, but results would take days. "We're looking at poison, Miss Marple," Craddock confided, his voice low. "But who had the means and the motive?" "Means are easy enough for the clever," she replied. "Motive is trickier. Look to the past, Inspector. That's where secrets are buried." She excused herself to take luncheon in the village, inviting Clara Weston to join her. The young widow hesitated but agreed. perhaps sensing in Miss Marple a kindred spirit or a confessor. Over soup at the Blue Boar Inn, Miss Marple's gentle questions probed Clara's defences. "You seemed so moved by Monsieur Duval's death," she said kindly. "Had you met him before?" Clara's spoon paused mid-air. "Only at concerts," she said quickly. "His music, it touched me." But her eyes told a different story, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the letter found among Duval's belongings addressed to Clara. "My dearest Clara," not the words of a distant admirer. She resolved to examine the letter herself, if Craddock would permit. Back at Willow Grange, the afternoon brought new tension. A servant reported finding a vial in the music room, tucked behind a curtain, empty but smelling faintly of chemicals. Craddock's eyes gleamed. "This could be it," he said, backing it for analysis. Miss Marple, overhearing, wondered, a careless mistake or a deliberate plant? As the day waned, the estate grew quieter, but the air was heavy with unspoken questions. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting, her mind weaving a pattern from the threads of debt, love, and betrayal. Charles's gambling, Clara's past, Gail's knowledge, Lady Beatrice's protectiveness. Each was a note in a discordant symphony. And somewhere, hidden in the score, was the truth about the poisoned bow. Chapter 4. The Poisoned Bow. The afternoon sun cast long, slanting rays through the leaded windows of Willow Grange, gilding the sombre air with a deceptive warmth. The estate, though grand in its Georgian bones, seemed to sag under the weight of the previous night's tragedy, as if the very walls mourned the loss of music and life. The great hall, now cleared of its audience and cordoned off by Constable Polk's makeshift barriers, lay silent, save for the occasional creak of a floorboard under a servant's tread. Outside, the gardens were a riot of autumnal colour, but within, the atmosphere was one of taut anticipation, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting for the truth to emerge. Miss Jane Marple had taken up residence in the library, a cosy room lined with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a massive oak table that smelled faintly of beeswax. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a grey scarf lengthening with each precise stitch. But her mind was far from wool. She had requested, through a discreet word to Inspector Craddock, to examine the late Monsieur Duval's belongings, a task he had permitted with a mix of scepticism and respect. "You'll find nothing the police haven't already seen," he'd warned, but Miss Marple knew better. The police, for all their diligence, often overlooked the small human details that told the truest stories. Craddock himself was in the music room, overseeing the meticulous cataloguing of every item. The piano, its keys dusted for fingerprints, the music stand, its scattered sheets of Vivaldi now neatly stacked, and the small table where Duval's glass of water had stood, now sealed in an evidence bag. The vial found behind the curtain, with its faint chemical odour, had been dispatched to London alongside the bow, and Craddock awaited the laboratory's findings with barely concealed impatience. "If it's poison," he muttered to Sergeant Lake, "it's the devil's own work. Who'd think to lace a violin bow?" Miss Marple, entering the music room with her usual unassuming air, overheard the remark. "The devil's work, perhaps," she said softly, but a human hand wielded it. "The bow was in this room all day, was it not?" Craddock nodded, his eyes narrowing. "From morning until the concert. Duval rehearsed here, left it for a few hours to rest, then returned. Anyone could have slipped in, anyone, Miss Marple echoed, her gaze drifting to the window, where a magpie hopped along the sill, its black and white plumage stark against the grey stone. One for sorrow, she thought, recalling the old rhyme, but not everyone had a reason. The library, where Duval's belongings had been brought for inspection, was a treasure trove of clues, though most were mundane. A velvet-lined violin case, a spare set of strings, a monogrammed handkerchief, and a small leather notebook. But it was a single sheet of paper, folded and tucked into the notebook, that caught Miss Marple's attention. Written in Duval's elegant looping hand, it was addressed to Clara Weston. "My dearest Clara," it began, "I cannot continue this secrecy. The truth must be told, or I fear the consequences will be dire." The letter broke off, unfinished, as if interrupted by some urgent distraction. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Secrecy, she thought. The word is a key, but to what lock? She recalled Clara's trembling hands, her evasive answers during Craddock's questioning. The widow's connection to Duval was deeper than she'd admitted, and this letter suggested a past that threatened to unravel her present. Had Duval been blackmailing her? Or was there another truth, more personal, that he intended to reveal? She returned the letter to its place, making a mental note to share it with Craddock, though she suspected he'd already seen it and dismissed it as irrelevant. Men, she often found, underestimated the power of written words, especially those laced with emotion. She turned her attention to the notebook, flipping through its pages. Most were filled with musical notations and performance dates, but one entry stood out. London, June 27, CHO 600, refuses payment, must press, CH, she thought, Charles Harrow. The debt was no surprise, but the note's tone suggested Duval was not a man to let such matters slide. As she pondered, a footman arrived with a telegram from the London laboratory, delivered to Craddock in the music room. Miss Marple followed, her curiosity piqued. The inspector tore open the envelope, his face tightening as he read. "It's confirmed," he said to Sergeant Lake, his voice low but carrying. The beau's horsehair was coated with a rare neurotoxin, likely derived from a South American plant. Absorbed through the skin, it would have entered the bloodstream via that cut on Duval's finger. Each stroke of the bow released more. Building to a lethal dose, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. "Ingenious," she murmured, echoing Craddock's own sentiment from earlier. "And so precise. Whoever did this knew exactly how Duval played, how long, how vigorously." Craddock turned to her, his expression a mix of frustration and admiration. "You're a step ahead, Miss Marple." But who had access to such a poison? And the knowledge to use it? "Knowledge is not so rare as you might think," she replied. "A doctor, a chemist, even a well-travelled gambler with connections in unsavoury circles could procure such a thing. The question is, who had the opportunity and the will?" Craddock nodded, his mind racing. The music room was open, as Lady Beatrice said. Servants, guests, dozens could have tampered with the bow. But it narrows to those with a grudge. Miss Marple returned to the library, her thoughts circling the suspects. Charles Harrow, with his gambling debts, had a clear motive to rid himself of a creditor. Clara Weston, with her mysterious past tied to Duval, might have feared exposure. Dr. Gale, with his medical knowledge and recent London trip, could have sourced the toxin. Even Lady Beatrice, protective of her family's honour, might have acted to shield her nephew from scandal. But the method, the poisoned bow, suggested a mind both cunning and intimate with Duval's habits. She requested a private word with Lady Beatrice, who joined her in the library, her face drawn with fatigue. "Jane, this is unbearable," Lady Beatrice said, sinking into a chair. "The police, the questions, it's tearing the household apart." "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "murder does that." "Tell me, did Monsieur Duval seem troubled when he arrived? Any hint of fear or unease?" Lady Beatrice frowned, considering. "He was preoccupied. He mentioned a letter he needed to finish, something important, but he was always so charming it was hard to tell." Miss Marple nodded, her mind returning to the unfinished letter. "And Charles? Did he seem anxious about Duval's presence?" Lady Beatrice's eyes flickered with unease. "Charles has been under strain. Those wretched card games in London, he's promised to stop. Duval's visit seemed to agitate him, but he wouldn't say why." Agitation, Miss Marple thought, is a symptom of guilt or fear. She thanked Lady Beatrice and excused herself, seeking out the music room once more. There she examined the space with fresh eyes. The heavy drapes, the polished floor, the faint scent of rosin lingering in the air. The vial found behind the curtain intrigued her. Had it contained the toxin? And if so, why leave it behind? A mistake or a deliberate misdirection? As evening approached, Craddock gathered the household for an update. The guests, still confined to the estate, assembled in the drawing-room, their faces a gallery of apprehension. "The laboratory confirms the bow was the murder weapon," Craddock announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "We're dealing with a calculated act. Someone in this house knew exactly what they were doing." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Clara Weston's hand flew to her throat, and Charles Harrow's jaw tightened. Dr. Gale stared at the floor, his fingers drumming on his knee. Lady Beatrice maintained her composure, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of dread. Miss Marple, seated quietly, observed the reactions. They're all afraid, she thought, but not all for the same reason. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a poisoned pen had been the weapon, its ink laced with arsenic. The method here was more theatrical, but the principle was the same. A tool of beauty turned deadly. Later, she took a turn in the garden, the air sharp with the promise of frost. The paths wound through clipped hedges and past a stone fountain, its water stilled for the season. There she spotted Dr. Gale, alone, lighting a cigarette with unsteady hands. She approached, her footsteps soft on the gravel. "A trying day, Doctor," she said kindly. He started, nearly dropping the cigarette. "Miss Marple." "Yes, it's ghastly. Poor Duval. You knew him better than you let on, I think," she said, her tone gentle but probing. "Your trip to London. Did you procure anything unusual?" Gale's eyes widened, but he recovered quickly. "Just supplies, as I told the inspector." "I'm no poisoner, of course," she said, her smile disarming, "but doctors know so much about the body's vulnerabilities. A small cut, a trace of toxin, it's all so precise." He exhaled a plume of smoke, his face unreadable. "You're a sharp one, Miss Marple, but I've nothing to hide." She nodded, letting him go, but her mind was far from satisfied. Gale's defensiveness, Charles's debts, Clara's secrets, each was a note in a complex score. The letter to Clara, unfinished and urgent, suggested Duval had been on the verge of revealing something explosive. Had someone silenced him to protect a reputation, or to settle a score? Back in the library, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed. The house was quiet now. The guests retired to their rooms, but the silence was heavy with questions. Craddock joined her, his notebook tucked away. "The vial's being tested," he said. "If it matches the toxin, we're closer. But motives, I'm drowning in them." "Look to the personal, Inspector," she advised. "Duval was no random victim." This was a performance, and the killer was in the audience. As night fell, the library's shadows deepened, mirroring the mystery. The poisoned bow, the unfinished letter, the whispered conspiracies. Miss Marple felt the threads tightening. The truth, she thought, is like a melody. It emerges when you least expect it, but you must listen closely. Chapter 5. The Widow's Secret. The twilight of the second day at Willow Grange settled over the estate like a velvet curtain, softening the harsh edges of the tragedy, but deepening the shadows of suspicion. The air carried a chill that seeped through the ancient walls, and the grand house seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating the next revelation. Miss Jane Marple, ever the unobtrusive observer, had decided that the key to unravelling the mystery lay not in the physical evidence, though the poisoned bow was damning, but in the hearts and histories of those entangled in its deadly strings. Her thoughts kept returning to Clara Weston, the young widow whose grief at Duval's death had been too raw, too personal, for mere admiration. The unfinished letter, with its cryptic plea, had planted a seed of certainty in Miss Marple's mind. Clara held a secret, and secrets like neglected stitches could unravel everything. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple invited Clara for tea at the Blue Boar Inn in the nearby village. A quaint establishment with low beams and a fire that crackled with reassuring warmth. The invitation was framed as a gesture of kindness, a chance for Clara to escape the oppressive atmosphere of Willow Grange. But Miss Marple's motives were as calculated as they were compassionate. She knew that a change of setting, away from the watchful eyes of suspects and police, could loosen tongues tightened by fear. Clara, pale and hesitant, had accepted with a nod, her black mourning dress making her appear like a wraith against the inn's cheerful decor. The inn's parlour was a cosy haven, its walls adorned with faded prints of hunting scenes and its tables set with mismatched china. A young waitress, her apron starched to crisp perfection, served them tea and scones, her curiosity barely concealed as she glanced at Clara's drawn face. Miss Marple poured the tea with practised ease, her movements deliberate, her smile gentle but disarming. "My dear," she began, passing Clara a cup, "this has been a dreadful ordeal for you." To witness such a tragedy, it must weigh heavily. Clara's hands trembled as she took the cup, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. "It's unbearable," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her tea. "Monsieur, Duval was so gifted. To see him collapse like that." Her voice broke, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes never leaving Clara's face. "You admired his music greatly, I gather." "Had you followed his career for long?" Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around the handkerchief. "A few years," she said carefully. "I saw him perform in London, and once in Paris before my husband passed." There it was, the mention of Paris. Miss Marple's mind seized on it, recalling the letter's intimate tone. "Paris," she said softly, as if reminiscing. "Such a romantic city for music. Your late husband was a musician too, was he not? A cellist, I believe." Clara's eyes flickered with something, fear, perhaps, or regret. "Yes, Robert. He played with a small ensemble. He loved Paris. We spent a season there before." She trailed off, her gaze dropping to her lap. Miss Marple sipped her tea, giving Clara time to compose herself. She knew the art of silence, how it could coax truths from even the most guarded hearts. "It must have been a magical time," she said at last. "Did you meet Monsieur Duval there?" His reputation was already blossoming. I imagine Clara's cup rattled as she set it down. Yes, I met him briefly at a concert. He was a friend of Robert's, you see. They performed together once or twice. Miss Marple's needles, tucked into her bag, seemed to itch for action, but she kept her hands still, her expression one of kindly interest. How fortunate to know such a talent. And yet his death seemed to touch you deeply. More than a passing acquaintance might warrant Clara's face crumpled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might flee. But the widow took a shuddering breath, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to say, not to the inspector, not to anyone, but Etienne, Monsieur Duval, he was more than a friend. In Paris before I married Robert, we were close. A foolish romance, nothing more. It ended when I met Robert, but Etienne never forgot." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. A romance, she thought, and a secret kept for years. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft as a lullaby. "My dear, secrets are heavy burdens. Did he contact you recently, perhaps stirring old memories?" Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, the dam breaking. "He wrote to me last month, out of the blue. He was coming to England, he said, and wanted to see me. I thought it was just nostalgia, but when he arrived, he threatened to tell everyone. About us, about Paris. He said he needed money, that he was in trouble. I couldn't let him ruin my life. Not again." Miss Marple reached across the table, patting Clara's hand. "You poor child! Blackmail is a cruel weapon. Did you pay him?" Clara shook her head, tears spilling onto her cheeks. I couldn't. I have so little, and what I have is tied up in the cottage. I told him to do his worst, but I never thought— I didn't kill him, Miss Marple, I swear it." "I believe you," Miss Marple said gently. And she did. Clara's anguish was too raw, too unfeigned, to be the mask of a murderer. But her confession opened new doors. Someone else might have known of Duval's threats. Someone with a motive to silence him. Perhaps to protect Clara, or to use her secret as leverage for their own ends. They finished their tea in silence, Clara's shoulders sagging with the relief of confession. As they walked back to Willow Grange, the dusk deepening around them, Miss Marple's mind churned. Clara's past with Duval explained her grief, but it also cast a shadow over others. Had Charles Harrow known of the blackmail, perhaps seeing it as a way to deflect attention from his own debts? Had Dr. Gale, with his quiet devotion to Clara, acted to shield her? Or was there another player, unseen, pulling the strings? Back at the estate, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Inspector Craddock had received a second telegram from the laboratory, confirming that the vial found in the music room contained traces of the same neurotoxin as the bow. "It's our link," he told Miss Marple in the library, his voice grim. "But it's too convenient, don't you think?" Left behind like a calling card. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her eyes narrowing. "A clumsy mistake, or a clever distraction. Have you questioned the servants further?" Craddock nodded. One maid, Elsie, saw Charles in the music room before the concert. She swears he was holding the bow, not just looking at it. He claimed he was checking the lighting, but she says he seemed nervous. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the overheard conversation in the garden. Clara's warning to Charles, his sharp retort. A conspiracy or a shared fear? She requested to see the music room again, and Craddock obliged, leading her to the now familiar space. The piano gleamed in the fading light, its keys untouched since the fingerprint dusting. The music stand held Vivaldi's score, and Miss Marple paused to examine it. A faint pencil mark caught her eye, a scribbled note in the margin. "Meet me after." Urgent. Was it Duval's hand or another's? She moved to the window, where the curtain had concealed the vial. The fabric was heavy velvet, easily hiding small objects. This vial, she mused aloud, was it dropped in haste or placed to be found? Craddock shrugged. Could be either. The killer might have panicked, or wanted us to focus on the obvious. Miss Marple's mind turned to Dr. Gale. His medical knowledge made him a candidate for sourcing the toxin, and his recent London trip was suspiciously timed. Yet his demeanour suggested weariness rather than guilt. She recalled their garden encounter, his defensive response to her probing. He knows more than he says, she thought. But is it about the poison or something else? That evening she dined with the household, a subdued affair in the grand dining room. Lady Beatrice presided with strained graciousness, her diamonds replaced by a simple pearl brooch. Charles was absent, claiming a headache, but Clara sat across from Miss Marple, her face composed but her eyes haunted. Dr. Gale ate sparingly, his gaze often drifting to Clara, a tenderness there that Miss Marple noted with interest. Love, she thought, is as potent a motive as greed or fear. After dinner, she cornered Craddock in the hall. "The letter to Clara," she said quietly. "Have you considered its implications?" "It suggests Duval was about to expose something, perhaps not just about her, but about others." Craddock frowned. "It's suggestive, but vague." "We need more, then look to the music room," she advised. "Not just the vial, but the smaller things. A pencil, a note, a trace of rosin." The truth hides in the details, Craddock nodded, his respect for her growing. "I'll have Lake go over it again." "And I'm recalling Charles for questioning. That maid's testimony. He's got explaining to do." As Miss Marple retired to her guest room, the house seemed to whisper with secrets. She sat by the window, her knitting resumed, the grey scarf now nearly complete. The letter, the vial, the bow, each was a note in a deadly composition. Clara's confession had illuminated one corner of the puzzle, but others remained in shadow. Someone knew her secret, she thought, and used it to orchestrate murder. The question was, who played the final note? Chapter 6. The Nephew's Motive. The third morning at Willow Grange dawned with a crispness that belied the oppressive weight of suspicion hanging over the estate. The frost had thickened overnight, painting the lawns in delicate crystalline patterns, and the sky above was a pale blue, streaked with wisps of cloud like the faint traces of a forgotten melody. Inside, the grand house was quieter now, its guests and servants moving with the hushed reverence of those who sense the noose of truth tightening. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual spot in the library, her knitting a soft grey cascade in her lap, felt the threads of the mystery drawing closer together. Clara Weston's confession had illuminated one facet of the puzzle, but it was Charles Harrow's nervous demeanour, his evasive glances, and the maid's damning testimony that now occupied her thoughts. The poisoned bow, the unfinished letter, the whispered garden exchange, each pointed to a web of motives. And Charles, with his gambling debts, seemed caught at its centre. Inspector Craddock, ever methodical, had decided to confront Charles directly, summoning him to the drawing-room for a second, more pointed interrogation. Miss Marple, invited to observe at Craddock's begrudging acquiescence, took her place in a corner chair. Her knitting, needles clicking softly, a metronome to the unfolding drama. The room, with its heavy drapes and polished mahogany, felt like a stage set for a confession. The fire's glow casting long shadows that danced across the faces of those present. Lady Beatrice hovered near the door, her face a mask of aristocratic resolve, though her eyes betrayed a motherly fear for her nephew. Clara Weston was absent, having retired to her room with a claimed migraine, and Dr. Simon Gale stood by the window, his expression unreadable, but his posture tense, as if braced for a storm. Charles entered, his lanky frame slouched, his tie loosened as if in defiance of the formal setting. His eyes darted to Miss Marple, then to Craddock, who stood by the desk, his notebook open and his pen poised like a conductor's baton. "Mr. Harrow," Craddock began, his tone clipped but calm, "we need to revisit your movements before the concert. A maid, Elsie, swears she saw you in the music room, handling Monsieur Duval's bow. Not just looking, handling. Care to explain?" Charles's face flushed, a sheen of perspiration glistening on his brow. "I told you, Inspector. I was checking the lighting. The music room's chandelier is temperamental. Always has been. I might have glanced at the bow, admired it. It's a fine piece, you know. Ebony, horsehair from Mongolia or some such place. But I didn't tamper with it." Craddock's eyes narrowed, his pen pausing. "Admired it, you say? For how long? And why were you so nervous, as Elsie described? You were seen pacing, muttering to yourself, not the behaviour of a man merely adjusting lights." Charles shifted in his seat, his fingers twisting the cuff of his shirt. "I was preoccupied. Debts, you know. Aunt Beatrice was pressing me to settle up, and Duval, well, he was a sore point. He'd won a packet from me in London, and he wasn't shy about reminding me. £600, wasn't it?" Craddock said, his voice sharp. "Your aunt mentioned you were in financial straits. Did Duval threaten you? Demand payment?" Charles's jaw tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might bolt. But he leaned back, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. "Threaten? No, he just needled me. Said I'd pay up eventually, or he'd make things uncomfortable. But I wasn't desperate enough to kill him." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes fixed on Charles. His bravado was crumbling, like a poorly knit seam unravelling under strain. She recalled the notebook entry. "CHO 600, refuses payment, must press Duval," had been relentless. And Charles's claim of mere discomfort rang false. He's frightened, she thought, but not just of the police, of what else might come to light. Craddock leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "Elsie's testimony places you with the bow in hand, Mr. Harrow. And we know it was laced with a neurotoxin. You were in London last month. Did you procure anything unusual? Perhaps from a chemist, under the guise of a prank?" Charles's face drained of colour, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. "A prank? No. All right, I'll tell you. I did handle the bow. I got something from a chemist in London, A compound. They said it was harmless, just to make Duval ill, to scare him off. I thought if he was too sick to play, he'd leave me be. I didn't know it would kill him." The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Lady Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Charles, you foolish boy! What have you done?" Craddock's pen scratched furiously. "You admit to poisoning the bow, then? Where did you get this compound?" Charles swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "A fellow at the club, shady sort. He said it was a mild irritant, nothing more. I paid him a few quid, applied it to the bow that afternoon. I swear, I only meant to make Duval sweat a bit, maybe cancel his tour. I didn't know it was deadly." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. Charles's confession was damning, but it was too neat, too convenient. A mild irritant, she thought, from a shady fellow at a club? Unlikely. The neurotoxin was rare, requiring expertise to procure and apply. Charles, with his reckless gambling and limited resources, hardly seemed the mastermind behind such a sophisticated scheme. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a young man had been manipulated into taking the blame for another's crime, his naivety a perfect shield for the true culprit. "Mr. Harrow," she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension, "this chemist you met, what was his name? And how did you know to apply the compound to the bow?" Charles blinked, startled by her intervention. I don't know his name. Just a chap I met at the Red Lion in Soho. He said the bow was the best way. Duval's cut, you see. He'd nicked his finger the week before, complained about it when we met. The fellow said a small dose on the horsehair would do the trick. Craddock exchanged a glance with Sergeant Lake. "Convenient," he said dryly. "A nameless chemist, a perfect plan. And you didn't suspect this irritant might be lethal?" "I didn't," Charles insisted, his voice rising. "I'm not a killer. I just wanted him off my back." Lady Beatrice stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "Inspector, my nephew is impulsive, but he's no murderer. Surely you see he's been duped?" Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression unreadable. Duped, perhaps, she thought, but by whom? Charles's story pointed to an accomplice, someone with knowledge of the toxin and Duval's habits. Her thoughts turned to Dr. Gale, whose medical expertise and recent London trip made him a candidate for sourcing such a substance. But there was also Clara's secret, and the possibility that someone else, perhaps even someone outside the immediate circle, had orchestrated the plot. Craddock dismissed Charles with a stern warning to remain on the estate, then turned to Miss Marple. "He's confessed to tampering, but I don't buy the innocent prank story. Too many holes. What's your take?" She folded her knitting, her eyes thoughtful. "Charles is telling part of the truth, Inspector. He handled the bow, and he may have applied something, but I doubt he acted alone. Someone guided him, someone who knew the toxin's true nature. Look to those who knew Duval's weaknesses, his cut, his debts, his secrets." Craddock nodded, his respect for her growing. Gale's the obvious next step. His London trip, his medical knowledge, he could have supplied the poison. Miss Marple agreed, but her mind lingered on Clara's confession. Had Duval's blackmail threat reached other ears? She recalled the garden exchange between Clara and Charles. The urgency in their voices. They're protecting something, she thought, or someone. She resolved to speak with Clara again, but first she wanted to revisit the music room. where the smallest details often held the greatest truths. The music room, bathed in the pale light of morning, was eerily still. Its piano and music stand untouched since the police's last sweep. Miss Marple moved to the window, where the vial had been found. She examined the curtain, noting a faint smudge on the velvet, a trace of oil perhaps or rosin. It was subtle, but it suggested someone had handled the curtain recently, perhaps in haste. She then turned to the music stand, where the Vivaldi score still lay. The penciled note, "Meet me after," urgent, nagged at her. She compared it to the handwriting in Duval's notebook. It was similar, but not identical. Another hand, she thought, or a clever forgery. She was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Lake, who carried a small evidence bag. "Miss Marple," he said, "we found this in the garden, near the arbour where you were yesterday." "Thought you'd want to see inside the bag was a cigarette butt. It's paper-stained with a faint residue." "Lipstick?" Miss Marple asked, peering at it. Lake nodded. "Could be. We're testing it for the toxin. Might belong to Mrs. Weston. She was seen there." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Clara smoked rarely, but she had been in the garden, arguing with Charles. A careless discard, or another plant. She thanked Lake and returned to the library, her mind weaving new patterns. The cigarette butt, the vial, the note, all were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. That afternoon, Craddock called Dr. Gale for questioning. The doctor entered the drawing room with a weary air, his medical bag set aside, but his posture defensive. "Inspector," he said, "I've told you everything." "I treated Duval for a cold, nothing more." "I'm no poisoner." Craddock's eyes were steely. "You were in London last month, Doctor. You have access to chemicals, and you knew about Duval's cut. Did you supply anything to Charles Harrow?" Gale's face flushed. "Absolutely not. My supplies are for healing, not harming. I've never dealt in poisons, Miss Marple," observing from her corner, noted the sincerity in his voice, but also a flicker of unease. He's hiding something, she thought, but not necessarily murder. She recalled his tender glances at Clara during dinner, his protective demeanour. Love, she mused, can drive a man to many things, but not always to murder. After Gale's questioning, Miss Marple sought out Clara, finding her in the conservatory, surrounded by wilting ferns and the faint scent of damp earth. "My dear," she said gently, "I must ask you something delicate. Did you tell anyone about Duval's threats? Charles, perhaps, or Dr. Gale?" Clara's eyes widened, her hands twisting her handkerchief. I mentioned it to Charles, in passing. He was so angry about his debts, and I was frightened. I didn't think he'd do anything." "And Dr. Gale?" Miss Marple pressed. Clara hesitated. He guessed something was wrong. He's been kind to me, always checking on me since Robert died. I didn't tell him everything, but he knew I was upset about Duval." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Gale's affection for Clara, Charles's desperation, the mysterious chemist. Each was a note in a complex score. Someone orchestrated this, she thought, using Charles as the bow, but who held the strings? As evening fell, Craddock received another report. The cigarette butt bore traces of the same toxin, but no lipstick, suggesting it was planted to implicate Clara. Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. A clever mind, she thought, is weaving a false trail. She sat by her window, knitting, the grey scarf nearly finished. The truth was close, But one final note was missing, a motive that tied the threads together. Chapter 7. The Final Note. The fourth day at Willow Grange broke with a stillness that felt like the pause before a crescendo, the air taut with the promise of resolution. The frost had melted under a weak sun, leaving the lawns glistening as if dusted with tears. And the estate, though grand, seemed to huddle inward, its secrets pressing against the ancient stone like prisoners seeking release. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, felt the threads of the mystery converging. Charles Harrow's confession, Clara Weston's revelation, and the subtle clues scattered like notes across a score. The poisoned bow, the vial, the cigarette butt, the penciled message, had woven a pattern she could almost read. But one note remained elusive, the final chord that would bring harmony to the discord. Inspector Craddock, sensing the case's climax, had requested Miss Marple's presence for a gathering of the principal suspects. The drawing-room, with its heavy drapes and flickering fire, was a fitting stage for the denouement, its air thick with anticipation. Lady Beatrice sat ramrod straight in a high-backed chair, her pearl brooch glinting like a beacon of resolve. Charles Harrow slouched nearby, his face pale and his eyes darting nervously. Clara Weston, her black dress absorbing the light, sat with her hands clasped tightly, her expression a mix of dread and resignation. Dr. Simon Gale stood by the window, his silhouette stark against the pale morning, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the sill. Craddock stood at the centre, his notebook tucked away, his demeanour that of a conductor about to lead the final movement. Miss Marple, her presence as unobtrusive as a soft pedal, rose to speak, her voice gentle, but carrying the weight of certainty. Monsieur Duval's death, she began, her eyes sweeping the room, was no accident. The bow, laced with a deadly neurotoxin, was a weapon of precision, its poison entering through a small cut with every stroke. But the true poison was motive, hidden in the hearts of those who knew him best. She turned to Charles, whose hands gripped the arms of his chair. "Mr. Harrow, you admitted to tampering with the bow, believing it a harmless prank to scare Duval into forgiving your debt. A foolish act, but I believe you did not intend murder. Someone else provided the toxin, knowing its lethal power." Charles's mouth opened, then closed, his eyes wide with fear. Lady Beatrice gasped, her hand rising to her throat. "Jane, surely you don't think—" Miss Marple raised a hand, her expression kind but firm. "Please, Beatrice, let me finish." The toxin was rare, requiring expertise to procure and apply. Charles's story of a nameless chemist is convenient, but implausible. Such a substance points to someone with knowledge, someone like a doctor. All eyes turned to Dr. Gale, who stiffened, his face flushing. "Miss Marple, I've said I had no part in this. My supplies are for healing, not killing." She nodded, her gaze softening. "I believe you meant no harm, Doctor. But you are central to this tragedy. Your affection for Mrs. Weston, your quiet devotion since her husband's death, did not go unnoticed. Duval's return, his threats to expose Clara's past, must have pained you deeply." Clara's head snapped up, her eyes filling with tears. "Simon, you knew?" Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "Dr. Gale knew of Duval's blackmail. Perhaps not the details, but enough to sense Clara's distress. He also knew of Charles's desperation, his debts to Duval. And he had been to London, where such a toxin could be sourced. albeit discreetly. The vial in the music room, the cigarette butt in the garden, these were clumsy attempts to mislead, but they point to a calculated mind. Gale's face crumpled, his hands trembling. I only wanted to help. Charles came to me, frantic about Duval. He said he'd found a way to scare him off, a compound from some contact in London. I warned him it was foolish, but he was desperate. I gave him a vial, something I'd acquired for research, thinking it was harmless in small doses. I didn't know it was lethal. The room fell silent, the fire's crackle a stark counterpoint. Craddock's eyes gleamed, his voice sharp. "You supplied the toxin, Doctor." Knowing Charles's intent. "I thought it would make Duval ill, nothing more," Gale cried. "I wanted to protect Clara, to keep her safe from that man's threats. I never meant for anyone to die." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her tone remained firm. "You miscalculated, Dr. Gale, as did Charles. Your love for Clara, your desire to shield her, clouded your judgment. And Charles, in his recklessness, applied the toxin without questioning its nature. Together your actions composed a deadly duet." Clara sobbed quietly, her hands covering her face. Lady Beatrice, her composure shattered, reached for her nephew's hand. "Charles, how could you?" Charles hung his head, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know, Aunt Beatrice." "I swear it." Craddock stepped forward, his face grim. "Charles Harrow, Dr. Simon Gale, you're both under arrest. Charles for tampering with the bow, Gale for supplying the poison. We'll sort out the charges in due course." As Sergeant Lake led the two men away, their footsteps echoing in the hushed room, Miss Marple folded her knitting, her scarf now complete. The truth had emerged, a melody woven from greed, love, and desperation, but it brought no joy. Such a pity, she thought, when human passions turn to poison. Lady Beatrice, trembling, offered Miss Marple tea, her voice faltering. "Jane, will this ever end? The scandal, the shame?" "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "scandals fade, but truth endures. You must be strong for your family." Clara, still weeping, approached her. "Miss Marple, I thank you." For believing me, Miss Marple patted her hand. "You were a victim, Clara, of Duval's cruelty and others' mistakes. Now you must heal." As she prepared to leave Willow Grange, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the estate. The violin was silent, but the echoes of its final notes lingered in her mind. She declined Lady Beatrice's offer of a carriage, choosing to walk to the village, her steps steady on the gravel path. Back to St. Mary Mead, she thought, where life is simpler but no less human. The mystery was solved, but the cost of truth, as always, was a heavy one.